Okay, well, it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Howard. He's Emeritus Professor of Philosophy from our university. He has his undergraduate degree from University of Chicago, master's and PhD from Boston University. He's published quite a bit, several books. In particular, the one that I found very interesting was Alaska's Permanent Fund Dividend, examining its suitability as a model, which should be very exciting to learn more about, assuming he's going to speak about that today. The topic that he will speak about, climate justice, is something that obviously many of us in the Institute are very interested in. We don't necessarily have a great deal of expertise in this, so we're very excited that Dr. Howard is interested in joining the Institute, and this is his membership talk. And we look forward to hearing from you, Michael.
All right, thank you, Paul. Before I start the slideshow, I thought I would just say a few words about what a political philosopher can bring to climate change research. Political philosophy is not a scientific discipline, although it often develops in conversation with the sciences. Political philosophy is a normative discipline. The central questions have to do not so much with what the facts are, what is the case, as with what we ought to do, what ought to be the case. And one of the central questions in political philosophy is what is justice, relating to questions like what would a just society look like, what principles would it conform to, and how are such principles to be justified. In the 20th century, most of the work in political philosophy on social justice was focused on nation states. But in the late 1990s, reflecting growing globalization, the emergence of global markets and global institutions like the World Trade Organization, as well as global problems having to do with what counts as fair trade, problems of global poverty, and of course, climate change, have raised questions like who should own the atmosphere as a carbon sink? Who has a right to use it as a sink? Who is responsible for protecting it for everyone on Earth and for future generations? I taught theories of social justice throughout my career at the University of Maine from 1981 to 2022. And I started teaching a course on global justice in 2008, both for undergraduates and for graduates in the School of Policy and International Affairs, and became increasingly interested in justice regarding climate change. I started giving some papers at conferences, publishing articles and book chapters. And prior to this, my main focus for several years had been on income and wealth inequality, what counts as a just distribution of those, and policies that could move us toward justice with respect to income and wealth. And one such policy that particularly interested me was universal basic income. I won't say much more about that today, except to note that as I began to get interested in climate justice, I noticed that one of the most promising policies for reducing carbon emissions is carbon pricing paired up with per capita dividends, which I will discuss that policy a bit later. In fact, my first publication on this was in that volume that Paul Majewski mentioned at the outset on Alaska's permanent fund dividend. The dividend, both in the case of Alaska and in the case of carbon pricing, is a kind of partial basic income because it is a cash payment that goes to every person without a means test or a work requirement, just as a citizen's share of the atmospheric commons. In this way, I was able to keep one foot in a field I was already working in while stepping into the field of climate justice. To solve the problems associated with climate justice, we of course will need the most accurate science to guide our understanding, engineering of the technology needed for new energy solutions that don't depend on fossil fuels or manage to counteract their polluting effects, but also policies to steer research and investment toward sustainable economies, and agreed upon principles to defend those policies. The articulation and defense of such principles and applying the principles to the defense of the policies is the work of political philosophy. So with that as a sort of introduction to the background of my own research, I want to turn to the question I'm addressing today and give you a little sample of the kind of work philosophers are doing, and address the question, what is a fair distribution of the burdens of climate change? And I'll actually be focusing mostly on a subset of that question, having to do with the burdens of climate change with respect to mitigation. There's been a lot in the news lately about adaptation and loss and damages in addition to mitigation, and I'll only mention those in an aside as we go along. So, the outline of my talk, I am going to first talk about what I call the climate change challenge. I'll explain that in a moment, and then discuss some possible principles for allocating the carbon budget, about which I'll say more as well, and then apply those principles to three cases, the United States, India, and China, and show that this will involve, climate justice will involve very substantial cash transfers. The policies I will talk about in the second part of the talk have to do with carbon pricing and dividends, which I mentioned briefly before, and also wealth taxes and other taxes. I'll just begin with a couple of quotes that kind of capture the spirit of where I'm going. Secretary General Antonio Guterres of the UN General Assembly said about a year ago that the climate crisis is a case study in moral and economic injustice. And so solving this crisis will be a matter of arriving at moral and economic justice with respect to climate. And we need to articulate what that means. Also, on the Equal Equity blog, it's a climate change think tank, my conclusion will be something in the ballpark of rapid planetary decarbonization will only be possible if the global north pays its fair share of the cost. This is only possible if the rich everywhere do the same. Nor is this an exorbitant demand. $1 trillion a year in public climate finance would be enough to get things moving. It is not much, but it is an implacable necessity. So what do I mean by the climate change challenge? It is a complex challenge. It is first keeping global temperature from rising beyond 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. But it is also doing that without locking hundreds of millions of people in extreme poverty, and also without imposing painful austerity on the most vulnerable in wealthier countries. This is a matter of justice, not imposing these unfair burdens on people who can't really endure them, but it's also a matter of political feasibility, because if we don't arrive at just solutions, we will not get the compliance that is needed all around the world and within each country. I'll elaborate a little bit on the point about not locking hundreds of millions of people in extreme poverty, just to remind people that still today, 1 in 10 people on the planet lives on less than $1.90 a day purchasing power parity. And about 17,000 children, according to the World Health Organization, die every day from mostly preventable causes. And climate change will only make things worse for the most vulnerable people in our planet. So the problem we face is how to allocate the carbon budget. I'll explain what I mean by the carbon budget is basically the amount of carbon we can still put into the atmosphere and stay below those thresholds of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. Three principles have been suggested and are widely discussed. The first I'll go over briefly is equal per capita shares. The idea here is to take what remains of the carbon budget and give everybody on the planet an equal per capita share of that budget. And that is what people will be allowed to emit into the atmosphere, or possibly a little more, but they will be involved trading shares. That's a possibility under that principle. It's a very demanding principle, as we'll see, but I will argue it's not demanding enough. A second principle is responsibility for past emissions. The argument is fairly straightforward. We have a problem of the atmosphere heating up because of carbon emissions. The people who have polluted the atmosphere by putting these emissions into the air should be the people responsible for emissions reductions. So a fair share would allocate it in accordance with past emissions. And a third principle is ability to pay, that the people who should shoulder the burden of reducing carbon emissions are the people who can most afford the cost of it without great hardship to themselves. So here's the carbon budget. Between 1850 and 2020, human beings emitted about 2.5 trillion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. Almost half of that was by the United States, Canada, and Europe. And what remains that can go into the atmosphere to keep the temperature from rising no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius is only 300 billion tons. That is with an 83% chance of staying under 1.5 C. And for 2C, the carbon budget is 900 billion tons. And again, with an 83% chance of staying below 2 degrees Celsius. It's important to point out, and that those figures I just gave you are from the World Inequality Report of 2022, following the IPCC report. When that was published in 2022, at that time, they pointed out that the 1.5 C budget at current rates of emissions will be depleted in 6 years, and the 2C budget in 18 years. Now, if we only have 6 years, and in fact, quite a bit less than that, because we're already almost to 2025, what is the point even of talking about a 1.5 C mitigation pathway? It seems like we're most likely to just blow past that. But I think it's still important to talk about 1.5 centigrade because of the gravity of the consequences once we go beyond that threshold. I'll just mention briefly some of the tipping points, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, that become increasingly likely at 1.5 Celsius and beyond for melting of ice sheets, loss of the coral reefs, and permafrost melt, among many others. Not to mention increased warming, droughts, severe storms, and the like, which we're already experiencing with increasing frequency. Just another comment about the carbon budget. I mentioned that the figures I gave you, 300 billion from about 2019 or 2020, is with an 83% likelihood of success in staying below the threshold for 1.5. We can, of course, enlarge the carbon budget if we reduce the likelihood of staying below the threshold. You could go from 83% to 50%. And I'll say a bit more about that in a second. The carbon budget is also somewhat flexible if we manage to decrease our emissions of some other greenhouse gases much more rapidly than we're decreasing CO2, for example, methane. If we could really reduce that very quickly, we'd have a little bit more room to maneuver with respect to CO2. What's the difference between opting for a carbon budget with an 83% likelihood versus a 50% likelihood? Well, it's sort of like the difference between playing Russian roulette with the world's future versus a mere coin toss. And it's a significant moral difference whether we give the future generations an 83% chance of our staying below that dangerous threshold versus a mere coin toss. So I'm going to stick with that higher likelihood through most of the talk, or at least something above 50%. Now, if you think about the carbon budget in terms of per capita allotments, the 1.5C carbon budget works out to 1.1 tons of CO2 per person between now and 2050, if we want to get to net zero by mid-century. And that, if you compare that with current levels of emissions, globally, the average is 6 times that. And in North America, emissions are over 20 tons per person on average. So to have an average globally between now and 2050 of 1.1 tons is a very demanding target to reach. Even sub-Saharan Africa, the average is higher than that per capita allotment. So what is a fair share? Peter Singer, the philosopher at Princeton, has argued that we should take that remaining carbon budget and give everybody an equal per capita share, and that would come to 1.1 tons per capita per year. As I say, even sub-Saharan Africa would need to cut emissions. But there are some problems with equal per capita shares principle, demanding as it is. First of all, it ignores all the past pollution. The United States and Europe have been polluting for decades. All that past pollution doesn't even factor in how we calculate individual or national responsibility. And that would be totally unacceptable to the countries who have not put most of this pollution into the atmosphere. Secondly, it ignores ability to pay. It's been pointed out that it takes just a few minutes of space flight. That's why I have Elon Musk and the rocket there. It takes a few minutes of space flight to emit as many emissions as the average person in the bottom billion of humanity will emit in an entire lifetime. So it's a very plausible principle that people who can afford the cost of emissions reductions without great harm to themselves and by foregoing certain luxuries should do so. Another way to factor in ability to pay is to say that if you don't consider this, and if you just give everybody an equal per capita share, it leaves too little room for development out of poverty, which is an injustice which developing countries simply will not accept. And therefore, wealthy countries must assume even more responsibility because of their past emissions and because of their ability to pay with minimal suffering. These two considerations, ability to pay and past emissions, suggest two other principles. One is a principle of responsibility, sometimes called the polluter pays principle. It's been advocated by the philosopher Stephen Gardner. Brazil made a very strong case for including this in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The ability to pay principle has been defended by Daryl Moellendorf. He argues that it should be the sole principle because he's worried that polluter pays principles will hold developing countries more responsible for their emissions than they should be held responsible for because they're still struggling out of poverty. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has argued that greenhouse gas stabilization should take place on the basis of equity in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities. And that's open to interpretation, but a very natural interpretation of that formula is a sort of hybrid principle that combines both polluter pays and ability to pay, giving them sort of equal weight. That's been advocated by the philosophers Simon Caney and Tom Athanasiou, who with some others have developed a climate equity reference calculator, which I will introduce you to in just a moment, that allows you to explore the actual implications of applying these principles in practice. In fact, I'm going to explore three applications. First to the United States, which is a high-income, high-emitting country with high per capita emissions. India at the other end of the spectrum, which is a low-income, low although rising emissions, and low per capita emissions. And China, which is in between the two. So if you open up the climate equity reference calculator, this is what it looks like. It's a calculator that allows you to estimate national fair shares of climate change mitigation. And you have some choices. For this exercise, I put the setting at the 1.5 Celsius low energy demand setting. What that means, in addition to trying to keep within a 66% chance of staying below 1.5 Celsius, it also does not rely on bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. If you allow for that, you have some more room for overshoot and then clawing back, but because we haven't really tested a lot of those technologies and options at scale, this is a more cautious approach. Then with respect to historical responsibility for past emissions, you can pick from what date. You can go all the way back to 1850, when the Industrial Revolution was getting underway. You can start at 1950, 1990, the year when many nations signed on to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. I set it at 1950. It turns out there's not a big difference between 1850 and 1950 in terms of how this determines national fair shares. There's some difference between that and 1990, but to give more weight to the historical emissions, I went with the 1950 setting. And then with respect to capability, the way this is factored in the exercise I'm doing is that anyone on Earth whose annual income falls below $7,500 does not have to assume the cost, the burden of emissions reductions. It doesn't mean they won't necessarily have to reduce their emissions, but the cost of that might have to be borne by somebody else. You can build in additional progressivity, but for this exercise I did not. And finally, in the calculator, you can set the relative weight given to historical responsibility for past emissions versus ability to pay or capability. And the calculator actually enables you to, if you set it 100% on capability, you're in effect excluding past emissions. If you set it 100% historical responsibility, you're in effect not taking into account capability. So the default is just giving them equal weight. And with those settings, the United States, although currently responsible for about 13.5% of CO2 emissions globally annually, is responsible for 37% of global carbon emissions. That's its fair share when you take into account historical responsibility and ability to pay. And what that means, and this is quite a striking thing, especially when I first saw this, this means that the US responsibility for carbon emissions reductions would be to reduce emissions relative to 2005 levels by 184%. I don't know if it shows up that clearly on the slide, but that's what the calculator reveals. And of course, the question is, how can emissions be reduced by more than 100%? Well, of course, you can reduce emissions as much as you can. There's also what we know to be negative emissions. You can plant more trees, suck more carbon out of the air, develop direct air capture technologies. But I think the cautious approach to these is that there's limitations to how much we can draw out of the atmosphere by those means. Those are more on the margins. And so the big chunk of this will be by paying the cost of emissions reductions elsewhere. So what this looks like graphically, here you see a graph of what the blue line is the US responsibility. The dotted line in the middle is what you might expect as possible emissions reductions in the United States, which would be something more than 50% by 2030. That red dot, incidentally, is the US Paris Pledge. We're not meeting it, but that's what was pledged. But the actual burden of responsibility is 184% below 2005 levels and nearly the same percentage below current levels. But most of that is then going to have to be, that responsibility is going to have to be taken up by paying the cost of emissions reductions elsewhere. Now, when you turn to India, it's kind of the flip side of this. The blue line is India's national fair share. It's almost business as usual for India. The red dots are their conditional and unconditional pledges for Paris, so they're almost meeting those with business as usual. The dotted line again is the emissions reductions that will have to take place in India. But most of the cost of that will have to fall on other countries because there's so many poor people in India, and India has a relatively small share of the historical emissions. They now are responsible for about 7.4% of annual emissions, but their fair share is less than 1% of global emissions reductions. China's in between. The blue line is what their fair share of would be, and their pledge is right on target. Whether they're meeting their pledge is another question. But they will have to reduce their own emissions at their own expense by about 11%, even though they're currently responsible annually for over 30% of global emissions. And they still, in fairness, should receive financial aid to reduce their emissions in line with what's needed to keep us below the 1.5 C threshold. So this is fairly obvious that countries like the United States will need to make very large cash transfers for us to be able to meet these emissions reduction goals. I did a quick back of the envelope calculation. If what's needed for climate change mitigation is, as many have suggested, between 1.5 and 2% of gross world product, well, gross world product in 2021 was about 94 trillion. 1.5 to 2% of that is 1.4 to 1.9 trillion dollars, and 37% of that, the US fair share, would be between 500 and 700 billion dollars annually. If you take roughly half of that for the cash transfers, the other half for our own emissions reductions, that comes to between 259 and 350 billion dollars annually. About half what the current defense budget is. Now you compare that, there have been lots of estimates of what this would cost. Nicholas Stern and Joseph Stiglitz did estimates based on different estimates of the social cost of carbon and said that the cash transfers should be in the range of 264 to 529 billion. So in kind of the same ballpark as my back of the envelope calculation. Now, if you compare this with what is actually going on, the gap is truly shocking. The total developed countries' Paris pledge is only 100 billion per year between 2020 and 2025. I heard yesterday at the end of the COP29 that they had increased this pledge to 230 billion by 2035. So the total developed countries pledge is below what the United States should be paying. And the United States share of that 100 billion pledge is just 43 to 50 billion per year. Now, what's the United States actually doing? The Obama administration pledged 3 billion and made a first installment to the Green Climate Fund of 500 million, which is less than 1% of a fair share. The Biden administration pledged 11.4 billion per year by 2024. That pledge is only 4% of a fair share, and only 25% of a fair share of the Paris Pledge. So we are very far from coming up with the cash that needs to be transferred to enable developing countries to meet their emissions reduction targets. So where will the money come from? It helps to think about global inequality of income and wealth along with emissions. This is the famous champagne glass graph of global inequality of income, where the richest 10% receive 52% of the world's income, and the poorest 50% receive only 8% of the world's income. And by the way, that richest 10% includes 64% of the US population. Wealth is even more unequally distributed. The richest 10% own 76% of the wealth, and the bottom 50% own only 2%. Emissions are similarly unequal. The top 10% of emitters are responsible for 48% of global emissions, while the bottom 50% are responsible for only 12% of global emissions. So how do we get to where we need to go? I've mentioned the international cash transfers. One policy I argue is necessary but not sufficient is carbon pricing and dividends. And what's also needed to come up with the money for the cash transfers is wealth and carbon asset taxes. So moving to carbon tax, or alternatively a cap on carbon with an auction of permits, both will generate large amounts of money. Carbon pricing in either form is necessary to internalize the environmental costs. People are now putting carbon in the atmosphere for free with a huge environmental cost. We should put a price on that. Putting a price on carbon will make renewable energy more competitive, and it will shift demand away from fossil fuels throughout the entire economy. In this graph from the Carbon Tax Center, the green line shows you the difference the carbon tax would make compared to policies that do not include this. It will basically double the effect on carbon emissions reductions. Now, as I mentioned, carbon tax or a cap with an auction of permits will generate a large amount of money. What do we do with the revenue? Some people argue we should immediately channel it into green investments. Others argue that we should be used for deficit reduction. But I think there's a strong case for taking all or most of the revenue and distributing it as per capita dividends. Why do dividends? Well, if you impose a cost on carbon that causes the prices of home heating oil, gasoline, and the like to go up, because low-income households spend a higher percentage of their household income on energy, this will be a great burden on those households. So as a matter of fairness, if you give cash back from the carbon tax, it will rectify the injustice. And I'll say a little bit more in some detail how that works. If you fail to do what's fair, what will happen is that we've seen relatively modest prices on fuel oil, on gasoline, have met with very strong popular reactions, such as the Yellow Vest movement in France, which will completely undermine the effort to put prices on carbon. So the dividend is a way of making the carbon pricing both fair and politically feasible. James Boyce has analyzed carbon consumption and the effects of carbon taxes. And he points out that in the United States, it's a sort of microcosm of what you see globally, that the top 20% are responsible for almost half of all the carbon emissions, whereas the bottom 20% are responsible for only 4% of the carbon emissions. So what would be the effect if we started putting a price on carbon? A $100 per ton CO2 price, coupled with per capita dividends, would be a net benefit to 80% of the population. And it would be especially beneficial to the lowest quintile, who produces the least amount of carbon. The cash back to them would increase their incomes by over 11%. So this is a way of making the policy not only palatable, but even attractive and popular. By the way, the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, which is another model of revenue put into a fund, and then the dividends from that are distributed equally, it's regarded as the third rail of Alaska politics. Nobody wants to take away the dividend because it's become extremely popular. So what would those dividends look like? Carbon Tax Center has estimated that to get 50% below 2005 levels by 2035, and then 70% below 2005 by 2050, you would need a carbon tax starting in 2025 of $20 per ton, increasing by $15 per ton annually of CO2. So that in 2035, the tax would rise to $170 per ton. Now, what that would mean in terms of dividends, I won't go through all of these, but just cite a couple. By 2035, every individual in the United States would receive an annual dividend of over $2,000. And every household, on average, would receive a dividend of almost $6,000. It's a very significant benefit. By 2050, the figures are even greater. This is what a carbon dividend looked like in sort of a snapshot. But I have to point out that, and remind you of what we noted earlier, that the 1.5C carbon budget is on track to be exhausted before 2030. So carbon pricing is essential, but by itself is not sufficient. And it certainly, if we're giving all the revenue back in per capita dividends, we're not raising money for international transfers. So we need to take another look at inequality. In the United States, the top 10%, at least in 2019, were emitting almost 75 tons of greenhouse gases per person. And the full population, the average was about 21 tons. Just to abide by the Paris Agreement, which itself is not adequate to even get us to below 2C carbon budget, but nevertheless, that's what people have signed on to. Just to accord with the Paris Agreement, the United States should try to reduce its emissions on average about 50% by 2030. Interestingly, the bottom 50% of the population, their emissions are already there. They're already below 50% of the average. It's the middle 40% who will need to reduce their emissions by half. And interestingly, the top 10% will need to reduce their emissions by almost 90%. How do we do that? Well, the authors of the World Inequality Report have suggested two taxes. The first is a carbon assets tax, and the second is a wealth tax. The carbon assets tax would impose a tax of 10% on the value of carbon assets, investments in oil companies and gas companies and the like. This would raise a significant amount of revenue, but the main purpose of this tax is actually not so much to raise the revenue, but to discourage investment in carbon fuel by making the tax rate high enough that they'd better put their money elsewhere. It's the wealth tax that raises the bulk of the revenue. If we need to raise somewhere between 1.5 and 2% of gross world product to deal with climate change mitigation and other costs, if you put these two taxes together, it actually comes to 1.7% of global income. That's how much wealth there is at the top. I won't go through this chart in detail, but this just explains that if you put a progressive wealth tax starting at 1% for individuals with net wealth between 1 million and 10 million, and then you ratchet it up until for the people with wealth above 100 billion, there aren't that many of them, but for those, they would be paying 3.5% on their wealth above that level. It will raise over a trillion, almost $1.8 trillion, which is 1.7% of global income. To quickly come to some conclusions, keeping global temperature rise below 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius is technically possible, but increasingly difficult. A necessary condition is global climate justice, entailing large international cash transfers from high-emitting and high-income countries to low-emitting and low-income countries. A carbon dividend is one necessary policy for reducing carbon emissions, and global climate goals can be reached without hardship for low and middle income households if high emitters assume their fair share of emissions reductions. And I might add, although I didn't make it a theme of this talk, their fair share of the cost of adaptation and loss and damages by paying carbon asset and wealth taxes. So, thank you for listening. And if people have questions, happy to answer.
First of all, thank you very much. That was very clear.
Thank you.
There must be some question. I'll go ahead and ask the first question. I'm sure you prepared this presentation before what happened a couple of weeks ago, just to a large degree. What do you think of the possibility for this operating in the U.S. now? And if it's more complicated, what do you suggest?
As a philosopher, I'm giving you the ideal case. And the politics of this are very difficult. I think even if we had had a different outcome in the presidential election and in the Senate and the Congress, it's been a difficult road to get sufficient interest in carbon pricing. Americans are just they rebel against tax increases. And it's a fairly straightforward policy, but I find educated people concerned about climate issues often are unaware of how carbon pricing and dividends works. It's just not widely communicated. And so to communicate it to the general population and convince them that it's not a scam, that it's actually a benefit is a really difficult task, especially when we now have, everybody has their own source of media. There's no forum in which we actually discuss these things. So that's a whole set of problems I don't have answers to, but that's the world we live in. If we fail to get around these complex political, social, communication problems, well, we know what the consequences will be. We won't solve the problem of reducing our carbon emissions, and we will continue to have the disastrous and increasingly frightening, in some cases, irreversible problems. So I hope that the awareness of that will finally bring people to the table. Interestingly, one thing I could say that's maybe a positive note is the European Union has now started putting, or it's proposed at least, putting border fees on imports from countries that do not have carbon pricing. And so the United States will then be in the peculiar position of, if it doesn't have its own carbon price, it will pay an import fee, a tariff to Europe, and the Europeans will receive the cash. Whereas if we had our own carbon price, we would put the price on with the effects throughout the economy of that, and we would keep the cash. So I think that's a good incentive for any country that's non-compliant, even if you don't have international agreement. If you have a few strong leaders, like the European Union, the United States could be a leader, but it's not a sucker's game where if you put the tax on, everybody else takes advantage of you. Rather, there are ways to make it work. So that's one little piece of this that I'm hopeful we will get around to solving in the not too distant future. Maybe a couple of years from now, politics may change.
Right. I have a couple more questions, but I think Cindy's next.
Oh, yeah.
Well, thanks, Paul. It's really a build on, actually. Mike, thanks for the talk. I really appreciate it and appreciate this work. Do you have any sense of what percentage roughly of countries currently have carbon pricing?
That's a good question, and I just don't have the answer to it. It's fairly common throughout the European Union, but beyond there, I'm not sure what the pattern is.
Okay, thanks. I'll look around. I'm not sure either.
Yeah, it's certainly not ramping up at the level that it needs to. And Sweden actually has, I think, the highest carbon price, but I don't remember offhand the figure.
I obviously can't see in the conference room. Is there anybody out there? If not, I'll ask a question.
There are a couple of people here. Did either of you have a question? Not yet.
I'll jump in then. That was very encouraging what the EU is about to do. That sounds like one of the most promising ways in which basically a tax attack by the European Union to force this. Two other quick things. It seems to me that although it's alluded to the relationship between greenhouse gas emissions and associated pollutants altogether has tremendous health impacts through water, air, all sorts of things. And it's not that the IPCC doesn't talk about this, but it's not necessarily brought into the equation. And putting those sorts of numbers in, I mean, there are 5 million people a year who die from bad air quality alone. These are premature deaths. And the cost of that and everything else that's related truly is a complex matrix of problems, but it would be very valuable to include that. Unfortunately, even if you reduce greenhouse gas emissions to zero tomorrow, people wouldn't get healthier immediately, but it's certainly something that for decades to come would have an impact. So it'd be great to see that added in some way if it hasn't already been done. And then the second one is more of a question. To your knowledge, how many billionaires have offered to buy into something like this?
I'm not aware of any off the top of my head. I know Bill Gates has an interest in the problem, but what he's done about this in particular, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think we can count on their voluntary solution to this. I'm more inclined to support a tax, but yeah, so I'm not aware of any of them that are pushing for this. Although I will say, when I was teaching social and political philosophy, I ran across an op-ed by Bill Gates Sr., the man whom Bill Gates Jr. inherited his initial capital to get going with Microsoft. And in the op-ed, he was arguing, as Warren Buffett has also done, that we're not taxing millionaires and billionaires nearly enough. Mm-hmm. Warren Buffett famously pointed out that his secretary paid a higher percentage of taxes than he did. And so there are a number of billionaires who are concerned about tax equity. And so it wouldn't surprise me if they would be on board with a lot of this as well.
And remarkably, it wouldn't have the slightest impact on them either.
No. I mean, when we're talking about wealth at that level, we're aware of people who sometimes spend luxuriously on yachts and mansions, but they have more money than they can spend, so they have much higher rates, percentage of their income going into investments rather than to spending on themselves. And that's why the 10% investment tax on carbon fuel companies is important, because they'll invest where they can get the highest returns. And if you reduce the return on investment through taxation on those precise types of companies, then they'll put it elsewhere. They'll put it into solar panels or wind turbines.
Thank you.
Yeah. On your point about health, the book that I took a couple of graphs from by James Boyce. He's an economist at UMass Amherst, does a lot of work on carbon pricing. He wrote a nice book called The Case for Carbon Dividends. I recommend it to anybody who wants to do that. And he does elaborate on the many co-benefits of reducing carbon emissions, including health benefits.
All right. Thank you.
Sure. Any other questions?
Apparently nobody disagrees.
Well, if I can just continue to persuade more people this easily, maybe this talk will get some wings.
Yeah. Well, it's something that people in the Institute need to know about and think about and weigh against carbon sequestration, which in my personal opinion is really not feasible at all. And a variety of other things, many of which are experiments that we ran by accident in the past, putting sulfur into the atmosphere. That's what caused acid rain. I'm a great believer in investing funds in research into this, because who knows? And we may, even if we don't learn how to do this, we might learn a lot of other important things, but I wouldn't hold my breath for it having much of a big impact. Anybody else out there? Okay. Well, thank you. We appreciate it. Look forward to being able to talk more about it and have you involved in our discussions.
That'd be great. Look forward to it.